Good morning. Pleasant good morning to everyone. Good morning to the distinguished panel and our viewing audience. I would like to welcome you to the webinar on Russia-Ukraine, a critical analysis, hosted by the Elmer Francois Institute for Research and Debate at the Cipriani Labour College and Cooperative Studies. My name is Ashaki Do, and it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to moderate this webinar. As everyone is aware, the conflict that is currently unfolding is quite complex and has a number of implications for the world. As a result, the Elmer Francois Institute for Debate and Research has brought together this panel to help us to situate the conflict and to understand its implications for the Caribbean and Latin American region. Please allow me to introduce the panel. Dr. Mark Raymond Curtin is a citizen of Guyana and is the holder of a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Government and International Affairs. He worked at the University of Guyana for 3 decades and served as the Dean for the Faculty of Social Sciences. He most recently served as the Senior Lecturer and Director Acting at the Institute of International Relations, the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. He has published several journal articles and chapters in refereed publications and has co-edited Governance, Conflict Analysis, and Conflict Resolution with Dr. Cedric Grant, and selected essays on contemporary Caribbean issues and international relations perspective with Dr. Marlon Anatol. He also co-authored with Dr. Kellen Roach a history of the Institute of International Relations, and his current research interests include regional integration, conflict management, and Latin American politics and government. Our second panelist, Dr. Jacqueline Laguardia Martinez, PhD, is lecturer at the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies. Previously, she has worked as associate professor at the University of Havana and researcher associate at the Cuban Institute for Cultural Research, Juan Marinejo. She has participated in academic events, delivered lectures, and undertaken teaching responsibilities in several countries in North America, Latin America, and Europe. She is a member of the Cátedra de Estudios del Caribe Norman Gervan at the University of Havana and is the coordinator of the Classical Working Group on Crisis, Respuestas y Alternativas en el Gran Caribe. Her current research areas cover Caribbean-Cuban relations and Latin America-Caribbean international relations. Our third panelist, Dr. Anthony Peter Gonzalez, worked as a lecturer and then senior lecturer in the Institute of International Relations beginning in 1973 to 1978 and from 1982 to 2003, where he taught international trade. He is also a former acting director of the Institute of International Relations of the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine from 2000 to 2003, and also served as the interim director of the Institute of International Relations at UWI, St. Augustine from 2011 to 2012. From June 2003 to March 2007, he was the WTO director and representative of the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery to the WTO in Geneva. He has published 52 academic articles, 4 books, 55 technical papers and reports, supervised 16 MSc and PhD theses, and worked as a consultant to several national, regional, and international organizations. I would like to ask the panelists to please give us their remarks. Dr. Curtin?
Thank you very much for inviting me to share perspectives on, I think, what is a very important issue for the global community, and more specifically for the Caribbean people. I think it's a very complex issue, and while not being an expert on the area, I think it demands analysis even from non-experts. I would say that in the first instance, every peace-loving citizen of the world must be concerned about an invasion and the loss of life in any situation. I believe that this is a clear violation of a country's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and also a violation of the rules-based international system, which also includes the Charter of the United Nations. And I also feel that it has violated the very sanctity and inviolability of borders which indeed in the context of my own country, we are striving to ensure that it remains secure. I think the complexity is increased when one looks at issues related to Russia. When indeed a country is encircled by NATO allies and NATO weaponry, and therefore one has to look at it in that context also, especially when there have been significant advances close to its borders by the NATO allies. I also believe that Ukraine has to be looked at in the context of its geostrategic and geoeconomic concerns to Russia. I mean, one could look at indeed its geoeconomic value based on the fact that lots of it's Russia's infrastructure that links it to Europe is based on the land in Ukraine, and therefore a protection of its economic interests are also, I think, of significance. In terms of the other geostrategic implications, we see, the Ukraine being seen by the Russians as a strategic location for advancement of its fleet, etc., into Europe. So one has to, I think, look at it broadly and to ensure that both elements of the conflict are recognized and recognizable. One must also, I think, look at the fact that since 2015, and I've looked at even the words of Mr. Henry Kissinger, who in 2015 argued that it must not be, that Ukraine must be the bridge between the East and West, and must not, in a sense, join the NATO alliance. So, and also I've seen where Bernie Sanders of the US, along with Chomsky, Chomsky and others, have advocated a level of neutrality for Ukraine in this process to ensure stability and peace, not only in Europe, but globally. So I would say that, and additionally, when we come down to the region, and I'm sure we're going to look at that in some detail, we have to be, I would say that the region has to be concerned about the issue of territorial integrity. And to look at this, I would say I have to consider what kind of emboldenment might be received by Venezuela in its spurious claim to Guyana, and it could, in a sense, encourage a level of intervention that is not acceptable. I think we also have to look at the United Nations, whether or not there's an urgent need for reform to ensure compliance with the principles established by the UN Charter. So, in a nutshell, what I would say is that the issue is not only one of Russia and Ukraine, but it has global dimensions which need to be addressed, especially in the context of its implications for the Caribbean. And I would hope that we could kind of flesh these out as we go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Coulson, for your comments. And I'll invite Dr. LaGuardia to please their final remarks.
Okay. Well, first, as Dr. Kirton said, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share some perspectives on this issue. Again, I'm not an expert. Actually, European, Eurasian issues, European history is extremely complex, but I believe we can try to share some information and some insight to this important issue that has regional and international impact. So this is what I believe, even if we might believe we are far away from the scenario of the conflict, we have to follow what is going on and trying to understand how what the impacts could be in terms of what might be happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. As Dr. Kirton said, I would like to start by emphasizing the condemn to the actions being carried out by the Russian armed forces. We have seen that there has been different names. Again, there is an issue of a tremendous, I believe there are two very well-established narratives. So it is even more difficult for us to try to get a clear and basic understanding of what is going on. But whatever the names you can put to this type of action and conflict and intervention, it is something that constitutes a clear violation of the territorial integrity of an independent state. And it is a violation of the principle of peaceful settlement for disputes. So this is something that I believe we can all understand and take that as a starting point. By recognizing this, I believe we need to be there has to be a consensus in terms of bringing diplomatic channels to work and negotiated solution and to urge the military actions that are already happening in these areas of Ukraine. There are already civilian deaths that has been reported, and this is something that happens whenever a war starts. It doesn't matter the reasons you might claim for it, is going to bring destruction, is going to bring death, and this is why there has to be a clear condemnation of these acts. Adding to what Dr. Kirton said, that I believe are very important and key features to understand what is going on, I would like to bring also to the discussion the fact that we should try to move away from the analytical logics of the Cold War rationale. I have seen that there is a trend in the debate trying to understand what is going on as a type of continuation of the Cold War conflict, trying to present the conflict as a conflict between capitalism and communism and making that a pure ideological type of issue. But we need to understand that this is something else. This is something that has to do not only with the results of the destruction of the USSR, but there are deeper historical roots, and there are also new dynamics that are looking at a recomposition of global capitalist relations that we are living in the 21st century. So this is why the analysis has to be looking at different historic, geopolitical, economic dimensions that are tied to the new logics of a world that we have, I don't know if we have the privilege to see, that is emerging. That is basically the destruction of an older way of understanding international relations and the emergence of new world balance, and of course new actors beyond states that are also playing an important role in this conflict that we are looking at. So this is another point I would like to make, trying to move away from the usual dichotomies that we like to place our analysis. It is not the left against right, it is not democracy against autocratic governments, it is more than that. It is even as difficult as trying to demarcate clear blocks of allies, because we can see countries that today have restrained themselves of advancing a clear position. So even to understanding how the forces are getting some type of alignment in this type of situation is quite complex. As Dr. Kirton said, I would like to start and this is what I'm going to base my initial remarks, trying to understand the scenario of where these conflicts are happening. It is important to understand how significant Ukraine is as a territory, as a country. We are talking about the largest European territory. I mean, there's people that might consider Russia as part of Europe. But if we take out Russia of the equation of the European understanding as a whole, Ukraine is the largest European territory. It has fertile lands. It has a very key geographical location between Central Europe, Turkey, Russia. It has the capacity of not only producing major agricultural products, but has an industrial base that has been built since the times of the USSR. A lot of that is destroyed, a lot of that is on crisis, but the bases are there. There are richness in terms of natural resources and minerals. The Ukraine even had the capacity of manufacturing rocket launchers, and today it has nuclear power plants. We all are familiar with the incident of Chernobyl, but Chernobyl is not and was not the only nuclear plant there. So we are not talking about a small country by no means. We are talking about an important piece in the geopolitical scenario of Europe, and that complexity and that diversity, it is also seen in terms of cultures and political sympathies within Ukraine. There is a range of political positions we can see within Ukraine, pro-Russian sentiments and anti-Russia sentiments. We have also seen the emergence of a very concerning ultranational sentiment that is not only anti-Russia, but has also connection with ultranationalism emerging in Europe. So all of that is making the understanding of what is going on in Ukraine and the Ukrainian positions quite complex. We have seen in Ukraine, after its independence, the succession of different governments, pro-Russian governments, anti-Russia governments, and in the middle of all of that, we have the people. And in Ukraine, again, there are. It is a country that before the 2013, 2014, it could be seen as an example of peaceful coexistence of different trends in terms of political and cultural values. But now the extremism seems to be winning ground in Ukraine, and this is also part of the conflict that we are seeing. I will stop here as initial remarks, but we can continue exploring more later.
Thank you for your remarks, Dr. LaGuardia. Dr. Gonzalez? Turn on your mic, Dr. Gonzalez.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and let me thank the Institute for inviting me. Maybe I should begin by trying to say what I believe is to be the root cause of the Russian invasion. You would find that some of the scholars, some of the Western scholars that have looked at this have tended to argue that for Russia, Ukraine is vital strategic interest. That is to say, they believe that Ukraine is strategic to Russia, that Russia is prepared to go to war in order to stop Ukraine from coming out of its orbit. And therefore, there's some justification, given the vital security interests that Russia has, for them acting in this particular way. And the analogy they make is to talk about the Monroe Doctrine in the West, where the United States up to today would not allow any foreign power to come and install military hardware in this part of the world. And that Monroe Doctrine goes back over 200 years. And just recently, they were talking about it. Recently, I think Mr. Pompeo, one of them, was talking about it. And we have the experience with the Cuban Missiles Crisis, where they came down on Cuba to withdraw the Soviet missiles. Now, I tend to feel that there's a way out of this insofar as it is possible to make an arrangement with Russia that will guarantee its security, but at the same time give Ukraine some sovereignty and some choice in Europe. And let me say that it's nothing strange to me that all these countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, a part of during the Cold War, during part of the Eastern Bloc, most if not all of them have gone towards NATO. And the reason for that is simply because of the fact that Russian imperialism is not something that has totally disappeared. Russia has never really walked away from colonialism as the French or as the British. You know, if you are a state next to Russia, one day you may find that they may retreat, like under Yeltsin, where Russian nationalism came to believe that these states were too expensive to maintain, all these Muslim states in the south, and therefore Russia wanted to get rid of them. They wanted to hold on to Ukraine and Belarus, and that is where they ran into some difficulty. Yeltsin didn't expect that Ukraine and Belarus would leave. Belarus wanted to stay, but Ukraine wanted to go. There's a strong Ukrainian nationalism that goes way back in history, even before Russia was formed. And he couldn't keep Ukraine within the Union, but he wanted to at least keep Russia as it is now with Belarus and Ukraine. So the point is here is that is there a way of trying to find some accommodation that would allow Ukraine to exist in Europe as a sovereign independent state and at the same time have a certain amount of security? As I was saying, 22 years ago, well, more than 22 years ago, 1991, when the Berlin Wall came down, Putin was a KGB agent stationed in East Berlin. And he, from then, was very upset. He lamented the collapse of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And he said that since then, Putin has not been saying anything different. He has been saying all the time, this has been the most disastrous thing that has ever happened to the Soviet Union, the whole collapse of the Soviet Union under Yeltsin and Gorbachev. So that what I'm referring to this is because in Russia, there is no fixed policy as to whether they want an empire or whether they want to retreat into Russia. And that is creating a problem for neighboring states. You cannot exist next to Russia and feel secure, not knowing if tomorrow the Russian soldiers would want to recreate the empire or if they would want to retreat and give you some space. So this is why in 1991, all the states around, most of the states, all the Baltic states, Poland, all of them, they ran towards NATO to become a member of NATO because they are thinking long term. You have to think about the hundreds of years of the imperialist czars and even before them, can come all down to Lenin and Stalin and so forth. We have to think about all of that in terms of trying to carve out some kind of sovereign space next to Russia. So the problem in Ukraine is that 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine was recognized as an independent state with borders and everything. For 30 odd years, it operated as an independent state. And there's some elements in Russia that have always felt that Ukraine should never have been a state. And we hear this came out recently in Putin's statement about going back into history at the time of the Tsars and saying Ukraine is not a state. They created Ukraine, they went all and took land from Poland and other countries and they put it together and they created Ukraine. It's like the British saying, for instance, that they created Trinidad and they brought us here and that we didn't create this country and the country belongs to them. It's an old kind of imperialist argument. But Putin obviously has long-term objectives. He obviously sees that Russia is no longer great as it was when the Soviet Union was there. He's trying in some way to recreate the empire because he sees China is rising for world status and China and the United States will more or less dominate the world in the future. Russia is a second player now. And I'm not sure, even if he wants to recreate that empire, which is, I think, almost impossible. Even if if he gets Ukraine to come back, together with Belarus and maybe Kazakhstan, I can't see him creating an empire there that could compete with China and with the US. But having said that, what I want to say is that I tend to feel that there is some kind of accommodation that we made with Ukraine, and the French have proposed giving Ukraine a Finland status, a kind of neutral status, so that it wouldn't really take sides and it wouldn't, put nuclear arms and intercontinental missiles on its soil that threatens Russia. I think that is one objective. Mr. Putin never bought that. The French have been promoting that to him. The Germans have also said to him something similar. And when he says that Ukraine is going towards NATO, the West is not in agreement with Ukraine coming into NATO. The Germans and the French have steadily refused Ukraine coming towards NATO. And he doesn't want to look at that possibility because I think he has other intentions. He doesn't want to say, okay, let's see how we could work out something with some security guarantees. You cannot tell Ukraine that they will never be part of NATO and you put that in a treaty for life. I mean, there you totally obliterate any sovereign power that the country may have over the long run. What you can do is to come to some arrangements that, they would not use Western missiles on their soils, and they wouldn't bring Western troops up to a certain area on their soil and so forth. They give Russia certain guarantees. But I tend to think that the Ukrainians have gone towards NATO and towards the West because they're tired of Russia. They're tired of the autocracy in Russia. When you look at all these killings of opposition members and journalists and all of these things that Putin is doing there over the last 2 decades, you must get fed up of that. There's no future in that. There's no future with all that corruption and all that dictatorship under Putin. They want to get away with that. And they have been relatively successful so far in building some kind of democracy. They have done pretty well in that sense, and they want to continue to try. So my feeling is that one should in a way allow Ukraine to really become like a member of the European Union and have some security guarantees for Russia, which could settle the issue. But I don't think this is what Putin wants. I think Putin wants to recreate in some way a Ukraine which he controls, which should be part of some new Soviet orbit that would allow him to, dream again of some kind of Soviet empire. But let me stop there, and we can have some further discussion as we go along. There are lots of issues involved in that, and I'll be happy to respond to questions on them.
Thank you very much for your comments. I would like to start first with a comment that Dr. Curtin made. Dr. Curtin, you mentioned that there's a need for reform at the United Nations. And this really is in alignment with a concern that came to the fore following as this conflict unfolded, which really questions the extent to which the UN is prepared to deal with this new breed of autocrats. The extent to which the UN is able to really exert any type of influence in an era where diplomacy and protocols seems to be failing. And so I want to pose this question by Ria Chaitram, who asked, is the UN capable of diffusing the conflict, or will it further expose its weakness?
Well, in the first place, my view is that there is a role for United Nations as an arbiter in global conflict. My view also is that there's a need, undoubtedly, for reform of that institution, especially when one notes quite recently, 2 days ago, the fact that the Russian delegation could veto at the Security Council a resolution condemning its intervention in Ukraine. It suggests to me that indeed that whole process is now flawed, especially in a new global order, an emerging new global order. And I think that it is incumbent on the membership of the United Nations to advocate quite clearly and to move in a direction of structured organizational reform. At the moment, we've seen a level of exceptionalism, I would call it, in some of the actions of member states, even after UN resolutions have been passed. And indeed, also, I think when one looks at the level of compliance or indeed non-compliance with UN treaties and resolutions, there must be another structure in place to ensure international or compliance with international norms and standards, which indeed would guarantee the safety and security of the peoples of the world. So my first response would be that there is an urgent need for structural reform, which will bring greater representation at the level, as a body in the United Nations, and that compliance must be a key component in that reform process.
Dr. LaGuardia, you also mentioned the need to really a sort of a new global understanding of the new dynamics that might be involved. And so it kind of feeds into the same discussion on diplomacy between hard and soft power, coercion. How do you really understand this new dynamic?
I agree with the idea that the United Nations needs an important reform. But this is not because the new breed of autocrats, because before democratic countries have decided to invade and the UN has been unable to stop them. So this is a problem that now emerged again as an urgency. But we can see that there are a lot of reasons for most of the states in the world, especially smaller states, to advocate for a revision and a transformation on the ways and the capacities of the UN. The question is if that could be possible considering the balance of power in today's world. But however, I do agree we do need to make the UN to work, especially in terms of guaranteeing the peace and guaranteeing the existence of the smaller states in the world. I believe that today there was a call for a rare emergency meeting. There should be a special session of the UN General Assembly to talk about what is happening with the Russian military operation in Ukraine, with this war. So we'll see how that negotiation, how this conversation goes. And by the results of that meeting, we could be in a better position to assess the UN real capacity to intervene here. Just a final note, I agree with what Dr. Gonzalez said about the impossibility for Russia to recreate an empire. I don't believe that Russia, or in this case Putin, believe there is any real capacity of rebuilding the empire of the Tsars or even the USSRs. These times are gone. But I do believe that in Russia, there has been a long tradition of understanding the regional importance of Russia and the role they are supposed to play in European affairs. And part of all this conflict has to do with a long misunderstanding or a long data detachment of Europe and Russia. Europe doesn't want Russia to participate in European affairs, and as part of this understanding, Europe needs to rethink its way to approach Russia in order to rebuild peace and rebuild a new balance in this area of the world. And it has to do then with the solutions here. For stop the crisis, Russia cannot be totally suppressed in terms of understanding the regional concerns of Russia regarding its European relationship.
Comments. I think it's important for us to, as we go forward, even though our main concern is the implications for us in the Caribbean and Latin American region, to help our viewing audience to really understand the greater context first before we delve in deeper. So, Dr. Gonzalez, could you speak to the Ukraine's position as a potential member of the UN and a potential member of NATO, and the implications for that? For why would Russia not want Ukraine to be part of the EU or NATO? Your mic.
Yes. Could you just repeat the last part of the question? I didn't
Yes.
get into it.
We know that the Ukraine wants to be part of the EU, and it has even made a request to fast track its membership, and it's even an application to become part of NATO. So can you speak about the implications of Ukraine being part of the EU and NATO, and why that will be of concern to Russia?
Yes. Let me, just before I get on that, say a word about the United Nations. My feeling is that whether the United Nations stays as it is or whether it is reformed, there's not much that could be done when a leading power, right, is playing such a role in this crisis. That is to say, even if we reform the United Nations, Russia would still be a member of the Security Council, and it would still have a kind of veto on moves to stop it from going into places like Ukraine. So you're dealing with a very, very complex situation. There's not much the United Nations can do in a context like that when you're dealing with the great powers. And this we saw in the League of Nations, and that accounted for why it collapsed. You know, the News and Leaders collapsed because you couldn't stop Germany from doing what it wanted to do. So there are other channels of diplomacy. We've seen the French and the Germans talking with the Russians. We have seen other channels in Europe. There are about 3 or 4 major channels of diplomacy which are trying to make some kind of headway on this crisis, and they probably have much more influence than the United Nations on this. But going on to the question about Ukraine being a member of the European Union and also being a member of NATO, I tend to agree with the Ukrainians that it is in their interest to go towards the European Union. They want to build a democracy that is sustainable on a long-term basis. They don't see a future with the Soviet Union, with Russia. Insofar as Russia is not a democracy, Russia has been doing all sorts of strange things in there to subvert democracy. And then we saw this, it started at one point to evolve positively, and then all of a sudden it changed, and you have this kind of autocracy arising in there. And if you're serious about building a country that is democratic and which is not corrupt and so forth, you want to get away from that. You want to get away from that Soviet, that Russian thing, and go with the Western European countries. Go with Poland, and then go with all of them that are part of the European Union. So I have no problem with that desire on the part of the Ukrainians, recognizing, and this I think lots of people have heard Professor Mesmer and others talk as though Ukraine is not a nation. Ukraine is a nation. The Ukrainians are nationalists. The Ukrainians who speak Ukraine, who are the majority in Ukraine, they are nationalists. There's something called Ukrainian nationalism, very different from Russian nationalism. And they want to go towards the European Union, like so many of the other brothers around them in Europe and so forth. And my feeling is that one should not try to stop them from going there. On the other hand, NATO is slightly different in that you want to give Russia some kind of guarantee that you're not going to put equipment and soldiers and long-range missiles and stuff like that on Ukrainian soil that threatens Russia. The problem Russia has there is that if you look at where Ukraine is or the Ukrainian border is, it's not far from Moscow. And if they put long-range missiles, even short-range missiles, they can hit Moscow, or they can hit major population centers in Europe, in Russia, and the Russians would not have the time to stop these missiles, even though they may pick them up coming off the ground through satellites and so on. They may not have enough time to stop them. And that is the concern really Russia has, that if they come too close, they can be very destructive and so forth, so that they need, in a way, to stop Ukraine from being able to position these weapons there. Now, I feel that you can get some kind of guarantees here for Russia, and I don't see why the Ukrainians should be against that. Any settlement of that issue must go along these lines, giving Russia some kind of assurance that these missiles would not be placed there and NATO would not be able to station forces in Ukraine to a certain extent. I believe that while the Ukrainians feel much more secure as members of NATO and they would like to go there, I think they could be dissuaded from not taking that route. But if you give them the European Union, for example, and you give them some sort of guarantee that you won't keep supporting separatist movements in Ukraine and all these constant border attacks and harassment on the border, as you see what Russia does there, 190,000 soldiers, you encircle them on the border and you have them constantly in fear that you're going to invade the country and all that sort of thing. I think you can lessen these tensions in that way and get some kind of mutual understanding. But I think one has to recognize that Ukraine is a nation and Ukrainians want to go in a particular direction because they do not feel very comfortable staying too close to the Soviet Union. And I can understand why they feel that, just looking at the history, just hearing from what Putin said there about Ukraine is not a state and they created Ukraine. All of it. I would be very uncomfortable living next to a country that where the president says these kinds of things. So my feeling is that one has to negotiate something that could try to accommodate everyone and recognize, remember, Ukrainian nationalism is something that goes way back. I mean, Putin didn't mention that Lenin recognized it and he gave them a republic when they were in 1917. He said Lenin needed support. Lenin was uncomfortable a bit. He didn't feel comfortable enough in power, and he gave the Ukrainian nationalists a republic, and he shouldn't have done that according to Putin. And we saw the Ukrainian nationalists fighting in the Second World War. They fought alongside the Germans to some extent. They supported the Germans because they were making a deal with the Germans to get independence against the Russians. This is what they wanted. So there's Ukrainian nationalism, and I think it's time we recognize that Ukraine is a nation. Yeltsin had to accept that Ukraine is a nation, and you have to give them some kind of independence. So that is basically what I would say with respect to how they deal with NATO and how they should deal with the European Union.
Thank you for your response, Dr. Gonzalez. You mentioned that guarantees can be provided to Russia. However, if you recall Dr. Martinez's comment that there are contradictory narratives. And so I would like to ask this question to all of you all. What accounts for the different and contradictory interpretations of international law? On the one hand, one country understands the MINSK, for example, the MINSK law, the MINSK agreement as entailing certain provisions, and while Russia says it doesn't include them. And this has been a narrative that has been evolving over time, where countries tend to view things differently. Who is responsible for ensuring that the agreements are understood and applied in a uniform manner?
Well, I defer to Jackie on this one, but.
Well, thanks, Dr. Kirtan. Before getting there, I would like to expand something that Dr. Gonzalez says that is very important and has to do with the guarantees for Russia of NATO not going near their borders. It is important to remember that after 1991, Russia was promised by NATO that they will not move to the east. And today, I mean, when we look at the movement, they have moved about 800 miles in that direction. Since 1997, we have new NATO members as Estonia, Lithuania, Polonia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria. So whatever the agreement was, it didn't work. So it is important then to find a new understanding to make all parts to be respectful of what they are supposed to have agreed. In terms of the Minsk agreement, what I have seen is that since the beginning, it seems that they were forced to fail, because they were written in very ambiguous terms. It means that every part wanted to understand something different of what it meant. What do I mean by that? In the Minsk agreement, there were several parts involved. We had the participation, of course, of Russia. We had the participation of the representative of the self-declared independent republics there. We also had France and Germany as guarantees of the Minsk agreement. And what we had is that the agreements were a type of map to go to the de-escalation of the violent conflict there. Let us remember that violence is not happening in the Donbas region 4 days ago. We have had this situation since 2014. Since 2014, there are people dying here, people dying there. There are bombs sent there. And it is now that when the world is kind of waking up to a reality that has been there for years. And the Minsk agreement were part of that attempt to de-escalate the conflict. The point is that, again, each part wanted to understand the agreements in their own convenience. From the self-declared republics, they wanted to push for a total independence from Ukraine. From the perspective of the Ukraine, and I believe the European Union, the agreements were to bring some type of autonomy and to bring some type of flexibility for these areas to operate, trying to make a type of federation within Ukraine, but without breaking the national unity and the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. But since the beginning, there were two different understandings of the parts involved in the agreements. And I believe that because of that, there was no advance. The agreements were never implemented. And maybe there was no real commitment to implement agreements that I believe both parts knew that meant something different to each one of them.
Thank you very much for your response. And so, speaking now directly to our region, many would have questioned as the conflict evolved, how does a war that is taking place in a completely different geographical location affect the Caribbean? Why should we be concerned? And so the question coming from our viewing audience is, what should CARICOM be focused on at this time? What tangible preparation should CARICOM start to engage in to manage any fallout which may affect this region? This is an open question to the panel.
Okay. Well, let me say that in the first instance, CARICOM, one of the major pillars of CARICOM is the coordination of foreign policy. And while there's been a level of fragmentation, I've seen recently in the statement by CARICOM a movement to ensure unanimity in terms of its approach. In my view, I think we must be concerned, first of all, about the global impact. And when we look significantly now at its implications for the Caribbean, we can see undoubtedly in the first instance a rise in the price of oil and petroleum related products, which have an implication for economies which are already reeling under the impact of the COVID pandemic. There's also the question of the supply chain issue and rising freight costs, which will impact imports to the region and maybe availability, given the access to shipping and so on, and its higher costs. Further, my view is that there must be an organized, unambiguous approach to the responses to that type of possibility and of reality, I think, which will emerge. Rising costs of fuel, rising costs of food, and its impact on the people. So here we have an opportunity at this point to move a process ahead which would ensure collaborative engagement in terms of acquisition of imports. Here we talk about intra-regional trade. We talk about the movement to increase the agricultural exports from countries like Guyana to the region to reduce the import costs and guarantee some availability, some level of availability. But my view also is that we have to be very concerned about the potential encouragement of this type of intervention by Russia in small states like Guyana. We've seen where there is this ongoing controversy, which, although at the court, the International Court of Justice, we still see some elements of tension, and sometimes one might hear of levels of aggression being exercised by Venezuela. And I've recently noted that Brazil, a country which has traditionally presented a strong position on the sanctity and inviolability of borders, is now lukewarm. And as a matter of fact, President Bolsonaro has publicly upbraided his vice president, who condemned the Russian intervention in Ukraine. So I think we have to be concerned and ensure that there's a regional level of solidarity with the position of Guyana in relation to a sustained level of solidarity, no weakening of that approach in relation to the controversy and the support for Guyana in the maintenance of its territorial integrity. And so that there are several levels, I think. First of all, recognizing the need for collaboration to ensure food security, the issues related to oil and gas prices, the people's welfare in terms of ensuring that there's adequate food available at reasonable cost. And therefore, there must be, I believe, a strong CARICOM advocacy at the United Nations for a strong diplomatic effort, engaging the global community to ensure that small states of the region are guaranteed security, which I think is necessary for our people. So that there are several levels, I think, of impact which we need to be concerned about and which demand very strong collaborative engagement.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Any comments? Your mic.
Yes, the main implication I see for the region is if a Cold War intensifies as a result of what Russia is doing now. It could well be that Russia holds, let's say, half of Ukraine and decides to negotiate. And those negotiations go over a long period of time, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, they're negotiating. And a Cold War starts where the West is trying to push back Russia. And that extends itself not only in the rest of Europe, but also in the rest of the world. And it comes to affect us in this part of the world. And I was looking at this in terms of the implications for, let's say, Russian presence in the world, Russian presence in places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and so forth. Now, if an intense Cold War comes about, where one is trying to cut the Soviet Union off from strategic advantage in various parts of the world, you're trying to stop them getting access to strategic markets, strategic raw materials, trying to prevent them from being able to extend their or project power to any part of the world. I think there we may see that the rules of the game may change somewhat. I mean, at present right now, what we have is that there's a certain kind of tolerance of Russian presence or Chinese presence in this part of the world. And there's a kind of understanding, well, they would not put nuclear weapons, or they would not put intercontinental missiles. And they bring some trainers, or they sell some MiGs, and they sell some tanks and equipment and so forth. So that's fine, and you could live with that. But my feeling is that if an intense Cold War comes, in the next few years, let's say, because Russia doesn't want to come out of Ukraine, and there's a whole war that starts, as happened with by the end of the Second World War. What we may see is that the Americans and the West beginning to come down on Russia with its presence in certain parts of the hemisphere. They may begin to intensify a campaign to try to get them out of Venezuela, to try to get them out of Nicaragua, even probably in Cuba to some extent. And so what is now a kind of cold, lukewarm war may now become a little hotter over time, and you may have some lines being drawn, some new red lines being drawn, which could make it very difficult for those who want to deal with Russia. So countries in the hemisphere who want to deal with Russia, who have relations with Russia, want to have, they begin to find it difficult to continue to conduct those relations with Russia. Already you see, for example, from the sanctions, what is happening, right? That is, they're cutting off all trade with Russia, they're cutting off all banking arrangement with Russia, and they're trying to stop Russia from trading and selling certain things. This will only get worse. This will only get worse in the future if Russia doesn't want to come out of Ukraine and decides to double down and stay there. So this is my main fear, really, and I'm waiting to see exactly how this is going to pan out. And we can only tell in the next few weeks, the next few months, exactly as to how this is going to stabilize. Is it going to stabilize with Russia remaining in Ukraine for a long time? And, pushing up its nose to the West and saying, there's nothing you all can do about this, I am not coming out of here, and so on. And then the West begin now to take additional measures to try to push back the Soviet Union, Russia. My fear is that that could have certain repercussions for us, even in this part of the world. So I'm looking at that. The Russian general, what's his name, he spoke about putting Russian missiles in Venezuela. And I got the impression as though he was speaking as though Venezuela is not a sovereign country. And the Venezuelans immediately replied that according to their constitution, you cannot put missiles in Venezuela like that. You have to get the approval of the government to do that. And so far, the Venezuelans have not given the Russians any bases or anything like that in Venezuela. So my feeling is that the Venezuelans are very conscious of this. I don't think they want to go to that next step in terms of allowing Russians to put strategic missiles in Venezuela. I don't think they want to go and give them military bases or anything like that. They want to get arms and they want to get certain other things from them, oil and support for other things and so forth. But I don't think they want to go to that additional dimension with Venezuela. But we never know because we are in a dynamic here and these things keep evolving. Venezuela has started the process to try to bring the crisis to an end. And they have not been doing too badly. I have put some faith in that process, that negotiation process. They have had elections, regional elections, and they have allowed 1 or 2 opposition members to win governorships in certain parts of the country. And by and large, people agree there were foreign observers. People agree that the elections were free and fair, and so on. And then we begin to see oil production coming back up in Venezuela. Foreign capital is coming back into oil. We begin to see the process of dollarization, which is stabilizing the currency and so on. And there's a negotiation process that has resumed in Mexico. So my feeling is that Maduro may not want to jeopardize all of that. I think he may want to probably try to keep that process on track and come to some kind of settlement over time with the opposition and normalize his relations with the rest of the region. So I am trying to understand really what are some of the wider implications here. And so far, it's as I said, one has to wait and see if an intensified Cold War is going to result, where the West is going to push back even further on Russia, and that may have certain implications for us in the region. I understand what Dr. Curtin is saying about the border dispute and the implications for some of that. That, of course, is very much tied up with what the Venezuelans may do, what the Brazilians may do, and what the Americans may do. And I don't think what we're discussing at this particular point in time really tells us very much on that, what we can predict from what each one of them will do. I think we have to wait a little down the line. I don't know if, for example, if Bolsonaro is like Trump, I'm going to say that Putin is a genius and that he's going to align himself with Russia or something like that. I think we're still far away from all of that and so on. So I prefer to wait and see.
Dr. LaGuardia, any comments on economic implications?
Yes, I recall that already CARICOM and CELAC, they have both stated some declarations in the basically just saying that, of course, they totally condemned the invasion and they are calling for the peaceful resolution of the conflict that has emerged there, of course, condemning the violation of the principle of territorial sovereignty and the principle of diplomatic settling of disputes. So I believe that the regional position has been put very clearly out there in terms of the CARICOM position and the Latin American and Caribbean position. I believe the cost of the sanctions is going to be high for Russia, for Europe, and for the rest of the world, especially in a region as the Caribbean that is so vulnerable in terms of food security. There are major concerns, as Dr. Kirton was explaining, in terms of the price of food, the price of wheat, the price of oil. I'm talking about vegetable oil. Let us remember that I believe Ukraine is one of the largest producers of sunflower oil in the world, among many other agricultural produce. So that combined with a not particularly successful or rich harvest in South America of soya, so we are going to feel diminishing in the offer and the supply of food for the region and for the world. So this is a major concern we have. As Dr. Gonzalez is saying, it is still very early to try to advance any major impact on the region. Everything is very speculative in this case. I do not believe we will see a new scenario of Cold War because Russia is not the USSR. It is not in any way. And it doesn't matter the personal ambition of Putin. They do not have the power of the Tsarist Empire. They do not have the power of the USSR. And there is a long way for them to regain that. If that were the case, they would like to do that. But again, this is speculative. I believe that in this new global order, the major contradiction is the US-China contradiction. Russia, everything that is happening now, of course, will have an impact, but I do not see a new scenario of going back to the Cold War times. But again, this is speculative. Everything might change. But in terms of the impacts in the region and seeing the US trying to remove Russia from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, it's not similar. Let us see something, even in terms of the military cooperation. And I'm talking about the case of Cuba. There is no way to compare the relationship between Cuba and the USSR in terms of military cooperation with the cooperation that Cuba has with Russia now. The main impact for Cuba will be immediately Russia tourism and will be, of course, Russia credit and Russia loans. But the military geopolitics has changed tremendously. For the case, and this is something interesting here, and I will connect with what Dr. Kirton was saying in terms of territorial integrity and sovereignty. This is very concerning for small states, what is going on, and for Caribbean states. We have seen the case of Guyana, but this type of preventive military action is very dangerous. And I can see it from the perspective of Cuba. If there is any type of recognition to the actions that Russia is doing now in Ukraine, that will be also kind of accepting any type of preventing military intervention of the US in Cuba, for instance. So there is no way in this part of the world and from smaller states to accept what is going on now and the type of resolution that Russia has advanced to the situation in Ukraine. It is totally unacceptable, and it means a real danger if this type of actions is accepted in any way.
Thank you for your comments. So just to reiterate, because a lot of the concerns coming out of our viewers questions are the immediate economic implications that may result from this war or this conflict. So in the short term, you do not foresee any immediate economic implications. Am I correct?
No. I was saying that indeed you're talking about a region already reeling from the impact of the COVID pandemic. Economies are, in a sense, already in disarray. And to add the issues related to supply, and rising commodity prices, it could have short-term impact, negative impact on the region. Access to food, to my mind, is critical, and food that is affordable for the people of this region. So I think there are short and medium-term impacts which must be addressed by the region. The issue of rising costs of petroleum products and food must be dealt with as matters of urgency at the regional level.
Yes. Yeah. Could I just add here that yes, there are serious economic consequences in the short run, and as Dr. Curtin was saying, even before this crisis broke out, we had very large price increases resulting from the supply chain problems, from the labor shortage problems in the United States, from climatic shortage consequences. Because of climate change, you have a drop in production of corn, all in the North Africa there, production of food staples have been affected, all in the United States and so on. So you find, for instance, that let's take North Africa. You find for the price of wheat has jumped by 80% from March 2021 to December 2021. Now just add now the Ukrainian crisis to that, and you begin to see what right? Similar with oil. Oil, you saw where the price even before the crisis went to about $95 per barrel, West Texas crude. And since then it has started climbing, and it is going over $100 a barrel. That means consumers are paying a higher price at the pump. In the United States, the price has already gone up $1 a barrel, and the government is thinking of coming in with and doing a lot of, adopting certain measures to try to lessen the impact on the consumer. Let's say in this country, we have tried to liberalize the gas market. We have not yet introduced it, which means that government is still in control of the subsidy process. And I think the government must be looking at it and deciding, well, to what extent they need to go back into the market and set the price. You see, the government sets the wholesale prices, the price that Paria sells that to the retail companies, and they would then subsidize whatever the difference is between that and the world price. So I think the government must be looking at this and trying to determine, well, to what extent they can keep the price of diesel down, because as we know, as the price of oil goes up, the price of gas goes up, everything else goes up in the country. On the other hand, we are going to get some better prices for the oil that we export. For instance, we export, and if we could find a lot of oil, our problem is production. We haven't been able to produce very much oil, but if we could find anything like 80,000 barrels a day, and we could sell that internationally, we will get very good prices. Now, our mainstay, our main crop really is gas, and we see where gas prices now is just going like oil. They're just shooting up because you had a problem in Europe before the crisis, which had to do with the fact that too much reliance was put on renewables, wind energy and sun and so forth. And then suddenly they discovered that that did not deliver, and they did not stock enough gas in Europe, given the severity of the winter. So all of a sudden, prices started to shoot up in Europe. And with the coming of this war now, this war is going to even make things even much worse, because you're talking about Russian gas, which supplies about 30 to 40% of European gas supply. That being shut off, it means that the gas price is going to rise significantly. So I don't know what's the price. I think was 4 something just some days ago, the Henry Hub price. As compared to, let's say, 3 something about a year ago. It's likely to go to about 5 something now in the next few months. So the gas prices are going to rise, and that's going to mean a tremendous burden for European consumers. The British government, for example, is already talking about coming into the market and subsidizing consumer gas prices. Our problem here is that our gas production has not been increasing significantly. We have been disappointed by some of the wells not producing enough gas. I think we used to be about almost 4 billion cubic feet per day, and so on. We came down to something like 2.6 billion cubic feet per day last year, 2.6. If we could just hold on to the 2.6 barrels per day, we may gain some additional revenue from the higher gas price. But even with 2.6, I've read there's some concerns as to whether we could even meet that. I think beyond 2022, we are likely to see some new wells coming on stream. There's some drilling taking place, which is likely to bring additional gas. So we may not be able to get gas up to, let's say, 3 billion barrels, 0.5 billion barrels, where it used to be some years ago. We may not be able to get that back up within this year. But there's generally a case of better energy prices. Even if we take things like ammonia, for example, we have a number of ammonia plants, and ammonia prices are also shooting through the roof. So, Trinidad would definitely benefit to some extent from these rising energy prices. Guyana would also benefit from its oil production, as it has a lot of oil coming on stream now at a very, very good time, and its prices will rise significantly. Ditto for Suriname. The rest of the region is going to have some problems because remember that oil energy prices affect travel. The cost of transport is going to go up significantly, and that is going to feed into goods and services and so forth. I guess travel costs is going to go up as energy prices go up and so forth. That may affect to some extent. Tourism, as you know, under COVID, has had tremendous problems. This is now trying to rebound. With this energy crisis, it may not be able to rebound as much as it was before COVID. So there are all these implications. I think Mark spoke eloquently about the food impact. There's a lot here that we have to be careful about. We've talked about during COVID about the regional production to try to build resilience, and in order to produce enough food to feed ourselves in the region. A lot of this could only be done on a regional level if we have work with Guyana, Suriname, Belize, and so on, where there's large land tracts that we could plant a lot of the stuff that you need to replace existing imports, because you're largely thinking about corn and wheat and so forth. These are the main things which we use to feed animals and make stuff, and those are the things you're trying to replace either by cassava or soya or something like that, which require large fields. But we have never been able in CARICOM to get our act together. We talk a lot about it every time there's a crisis. We talk about it when COVID started 2 years ago, how we could get this thing going and start mass-scale production of soya and corn and so on to replace the importation of wheat and corn and all of that. But we have not really been too successful. But we will have to keep trying and keep looking at it, because however you look at it, there are these crises that we are going to face in this region, whether it's a pandemic or whether there's some Cold War breaking out or something, shortages arising from something. We're going to have to basically see how we could build resilience in this region, at least for the basics. So I think that is something that we have to keep on the agenda and see to what extent we can work assiduously to develop it.
But just let me add briefly, though, Shaki,
Sure.
that indeed Ghana may benefit from increasing prices of its crude oil, a new sector. It will undoubtedly benefit from increases in prices of gold, as we've seen emerging. But I think the important thing is the management of the proceeds of that kind of profit, so to speak, and how it trickles down to benefit the people, especially since our import bill is also high. And we haven't, as a region, expanded the agro-industrial sector. As Dr. Gonzalez indicated, and I agree, we've always been talking about the need to reduce the regional import bill, especially of food, and the need for Guyana and Suriname and Belize as states with large tracts of land to develop the agricultural capacity to feed the region. But that's long on rhetoric, but indeed short on action. And if this crisis is an impetus for us to, as a region, to move that process forward, then I would say that that's a positive outcome for us. But we need to have, indeed, to my mind, a strong regional agreement approach that removes levels of fragmentation and insularity to include a common need, or to ensure that a common need of our people, that is food, at reasonable cost, is available across our region. So my view is that, yes, we have been talking for a long time, and this must give us a new beginning, a new opportunity to put on the ground, to operationalize what we've been talking about since I was in short pants.
Dr. Curtin, I am glad that you raised the point of the positive outcomes that could come out of this not out of the conflict, but the impetus that they could create in terms of causing intra-regional cooperation and trading, and also to remind us that we need to be able to manage the proceeds from this increase in oil prices and so on. Just quickly, I want us to discuss a bit some of the security implications. There are a number of concerns in terms of the extent to which Venezuela's support or alliance or with the Russian president could give the feeling of insecurity in Venezuela, and how could this then exacerbate the irregular migration that we have already been experiencing in the region? This is an open question to the forum.
Well, I would say that the issue of migration and its management is an ongoing issue which impacts the region. We have to recognize that over the years, our brothers and sisters in Venezuela have been negatively impacted by instability, political and economic, and have moved to ground or to attempted to go into friendly spaces. I think those spaces must be managed now. And while I don't think that there would be increased migrant activity as a result of this crisis, I think one has to look at the management issue once again very, very carefully to ensure that there is a standardization of policy across the region, which will not necessarily negatively impact the potential migrant, but strongly managed and controlled. Now, the question you ask, whether or not it would bring about more, is that so? Was that the question?
Yes, whether the feeling of insecurity due to this alliance with Russia could lead to a feeling of insecurity that will further exacerbate the illegal or the irregular migration to the region.
I think that's a speculative answer, what one could only give. But we see rising levels of economic displacement in Venezuela, fueling the movement of migrants even today. And once again, I think the management of that movement is critical. And we must ensure that at the end of the day, we talk about understanding the condition of our brothers and sisters in the region and providing policy guidelines which would not be to their detriment.
Thank you. Dr. LaGuardia, any comments?
I believe I agree with what Dr. Kirton has explained. The main impact in the region will be, the way I see it, on the economic perspective and what might be happening in terms of our very most of our weak economy that has been affected by COVID. So that will be adding more economic vulnerability to the global system and also in terms of the region. In terms of insecurity in the Latin American and the Caribbean space at this moment, again, we are talking as what happened in February 28. Up to this moment, I don't see any major security risk when understanding security from a military perspective. Again, I don't believe that we'll be putting any alerts more than the ones that the whole world have. But the way I see it is basically an economic impact that might affect some countries more than others.
Thank you, Dr. LaGuardia. Dr. Gonzalez? Unmute the mic.
I think the increase in oil prices and gas prices should to some extent assist the Venezuelan government. They have started to boost oil production. I think they're back now to about a million barrels a day from about 500,000 just about 4 or 5 months ago. And they would certainly be able to make maximum use of that additional revenue, because that is the mainstay in terms of foreign exchange. And I have looked at some figures of migrants in relation to the price of oil or in relation to the revenue of the Venezuelan government. And there's a clear kind of correlation, a clear kind of relationship between when oil is doing well in Venezuela and when migrants are leaving. I think oil provides you with foreign exchange. A good oil price provides you with foreign exchange, which enables you to purchase basics of food and medicine. And that, to some extent, helps to stop the flow of migrants. Venezuelan migrants largely move on the basis of in search of food and medicine. Basically, an economic phenomenon. If they can't get access to these things, they tend to move. So to some extent, if there's some improvement in the situation, I would think that there would be less migrants that would be flowing out of Venezuela. And let us remember that when COVID came, things deteriorated so much in the neighboring countries, in Colombia, in Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and so forth. And even in Trinidad here, that Venezuelans started to go back to Venezuela. They found that they were having difficulties here in terms of getting access to food, access to certain facilities, and so forth. And many of them opted to go back to their country of origin. So that my suspicion is that with the improvement in things in Venezuela, and I say this very guardedly, yes, oil production is increasing. Yes, private capital is coming back into Venezuela. Yes, production is increasing. Yes, inflation is stabilizing with the dollarization and so on. Given all that, you have conditions there which could in a way work together with the increase in oil prices and the increase in gas prices to make Venezuela a little more stable, a little more attractive for people to stay. I think foreign investment would get a boost because Venezuela has substantial gas reserves. And remember now, in the context where Europe is looking for alternatives to Russian supply, because what is coming out very clearly to me here is that the Europeans want to get away from their excessive dependence on Russian gas. So they're looking to some extent to find alternatives outside of Russia. The Middle East states, to some extent, running to try to provide them with that alternative. But I think, countries in the region here, in particular Venezuela, with massive gas reserves, do stand a chance to really get their share of that market. So I suspect that you're likely to see investors coming into Venezuela looking now to invest in oil and invest in gas as a result of this situation there. And Venezuela has one of the largest gas reserves, or oil reserves, in the world. Heavy oil, yeah, but which you could use if you could process and so on. We'd like to get rid of that given the climate situation and so on, but we have to be realistic in terms of how fast we can do it. Given the complexities of the world and so on, we may not be able to get rid of these fossil fuels as quickly as we think. It will take a longer time to do it. So I would say that the situation may well favor Venezuela in terms of economic and in terms of lessening the flow of Venezuelan migrants to its neighbors.
Thank you very much for your response. One final area I'd like to discuss before we leave is the area of managing fake news. Dr. Laguardia, you mentioned earlier the existence of the different and contradictory narratives. And I want to align this question to one of the comments made by the viewers in terms of the disparity in reporting of the conflict. How critical is it for us to ensure that the correct news is broadcasted in order to instill a sort of critical thinking and not panic in the region?
Well, I believe that the fake news problem, of course, is not only something that we can see in this conflict. It is something that has intensified, especially with the expansion of social media and new channels of communication. I was happy to see that there are some websites that are actually tracking fake news and are making easier for critical information channels and for people around the world to track where some fake could be. For instance, there has been the denounce of images from combats that has been extracted from a 3D video game, and that has been used by TV stations. There has been pictures taken that has been totally out of context. So I believe that we need to create personally and collectively a more critical understanding of the information we consume and be sure to contrast information and to gain access to several sources of information. It is not only about the TV channels we have access to. We should, if we have the possibility to go to internet, let us see what the other channels are saying. Let us try to find other sources of information, and also trying to go and track all these efforts that a lot of journalists are doing in terms of fake news. I saw an example in a Caribbean news media company that they used a picture that was totally out of context and from many years ago. I might expect more responsibility in terms of the information we are provided, and at least a very easy fact check will tell you that this picture was totally incorrect and out of context. But again, this is also part of a personally and collective responsibility on trying to contrast the type of information we consume nowadays.
Thank you very much. Dr. Curtin, any comments on this issue?
Well, all I would say is that indeed there's a need for responsible journalism. And while access to social media has emerged as a major element in dialogue and discourse, it hasn't been reasoned dialogue across that form. And I think it's important for us, and I agree with Jacqueline, that personal responsibility to look at all sides, in a sense, look at various media forms, is critical for us to get a clearer understanding of the issue, so that we don't rely on one segment, but rather to look at the various forms to come up with informed positions that we may take. So I think that there is both individual and collective responsibility to do so.
Thank you for your response, Dr. Gonzalez. Any comments? Your mic.
Quite separate from the war in Ukraine. We have a problem here today with the rise of social media, all these platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all these sort of things. We have the production of fake news and a whole world of what you may call post-truth, where people are generating narratives and countries and all of that and creating their own what they call alternative reality. This is a whole totally different world. And to survive in that world, you have, in a way, to develop systems for checking information. For instance, I don't take information unless I'm thoroughly able to check it. I have to check that from several sources first before I even begin to look at it. Because all kinds of information is coming at you all the time. And you don't really know what is true and what is not true. So my feeling is that because of this kind of new world we are entering into, where a lot of these platforms, Facebook and internet and so forth, have not assumed responsibility for verifying the news, verifying these things. They just allow people to put all sorts of things on the platform. Right now, some of them are saying, okay, look, they have to accept some responsibility, and the U.S. Senate is coming down on them now, and they're looking at ways they're trying to stop people from publishing false news and stuff like that. But ultimately, the responsibility is on the individual to check properly the news. I understand that there are some reliable fact-checking sources where you could run things through and check the news. I have not had the time to engage on that. I find it's kind of time-consuming for me to go and check every piece of news. So what I do is basically I don't repeat something until a certain time pass, and I've seen it played out in several other places, and I believe that it is acceptable. But it's not an easy situation. It's very difficult for for people who are not very discerning to go along with things which are not true, and to form opinions and determine action on the basis of false things. And I really don't know. I mean, at the collective level, let's say at the government level, I'm not sure exactly what governments need to do on this. I mean, I'm seeing where they are coming down, like all in China, for example, they are coming down on Facebook and a lot of the platforms, and they're trying to control things somewhat there. People privacy information, what you could publish, what you could not publish. We have, for example, in this country, a very absurd situation where people are publishing pictures. They saw an accident occurs on the road, somebody gets shot. They're publishing the dead body, people's body with all the limbs out, and the family has not even seen the body and stuff like that, and they're publishing that going all over the internet, all to their friends and so forth. I'm amazed, I mean, I saw recently, and this is personal, with my brother who had a break-in and so forth, and within the hour, that was all over the internet, all over WhatsApp. People had it from there. They were saying things like that, and so I just kept quiet. But we need to have some guidelines, some norms as to how we deal with this, because it's becoming pretty ridiculous. If you ever look now on an accident on the road, and you see how everybody running with their camera to take pictures of people and put it on the internet and so on. I mean, it's kind of scandalous. And I mean, we have to come around to getting this thing changed. I don't have an answer, to be very honest with you, but I think we have to be able to get social media, we have to be able to get these platforms to work with us to be able to control these things. And at the same time, the individual, I agree with Mark, the individual has to assume some kind of responsibility to properly vet what is coming to him, to make sure he doesn't repeat it. For instance, it took me a while to stop reproducing videos, forwarding videos automatically to other people. I have stopped a lot of that now because I realize that half of those videos are at times not true videos, and that you're only perpetuating false things and all of that. So I'm very careful now in what I send to people. I try to wait and verify now before I send it around. So there's a sense of personal responsibility here in these things that we need to inculcate in many of our citizens.
Okay, thank you for your response, Dr. Gonzalez. Before you wrap up, I'd like to ask you to each give your final remarks in regards to this conflict and its implications for the Caribbean going forward.
Well, very quickly, I would say that this international issue, the crisis in Ukraine, has both global and regional reach and implication. I think that what for me is important would be the issue of a sustained diplomatic effort with honest brokers, both at the United Nations and coalitions of countries levels, to bring an end or to de-escalate the tensions and the conflict which exists. I would say that as a region, in the short term, we need to collectively, carefully identify and deal with some of those issues that emerge. And once again, I argue for a collective approach to food security, the problems of rising prices, the global supply chain issues, and most or equally as important, the benefits which could accrue from increased prices of our export products and the benefits that must derive and and to provide, in a sense, benefits for the people of the region. So I think that there are several levels which we need to deal at. First is to look at the United Nations and make every effort as a Caribbean community to influence the strong diplomatic efforts necessary at the level of the Caribbean community, more energetic approaches to regional food security, and at individual states, small states, to recognize the need to ensure that our people are not, in a sense, more negatively impacted by increasing food prices.
Thank you, Dr. Curtin. Dr. LaGuardia?
Yes, well, I agree with what Dr. Kirton has explained. I would like to use this final moment to bring three comments into the discussion. Well, first has to do with NATO and the European Union. I believe that this crisis has proven how NATO has worked poorly for Europe. And I would like to make a distinction here. I'm not saying that NATO is a mechanism that has not a purpose in terms of how it was thought. Actually, what I believe is that NATO will become more powerful in a sense after this crisis, because part of the security approach in Europe right now would be to try to strengthen NATO, trying to rearm a lot of the European armies, trying to make the European armies and military and weaponry more modern. So in terms of NATO as an organization, this crisis might well work in terms of making NATO stronger. And that would be an issue of concern. But this is one thing. What I would like to stress here is what Europe needs to rethink in terms of building its foreign affairs and its security doctrine out of NATO, meaning out of the heavy influence of a U.S. intervention in the way the foreign policy and the security strategy in Europe should be. And if there is something that Europe should learn from this crisis, is to take a more sovereign approach in terms of understanding regional security. And that could be a major issue actually to be following in terms of European relations and how Europe again has to understand a way to reach Russia. Because I don't see Europe building any type of security regime without a conversation with Russia. There's something that Dr. Gonzalez said that I believe is very important and has to do with Ukraine relations with the European Union, that it is something different that Ukraine is part of NATO, that I believe we already understand the risks of going into that direction. A lot of emphasis in conversations today has to do with the relationship of Ukraine and Russia and how these two peoples are coming from very close past, but at the same time, I believe it is important to understand people's realities and aspirations for the future. So it means that if there is a major consensus from the Ukraine people to walk more towards Europe and not necessarily to Russia, there has to be mechanisms for that claim to be heard. And one of the major issues here had to do with who is responsible of listening what Ukrainian people actually want, considering the diversity that exists within the Ukrainian people, its culture, and its political views. In this regard, I believe there is a factor that we also need to take into consideration, that is political extremism, that we have seen that going through Europe and most concerningly in Ukraine. It is something that has been rising. This is not a new phenomenon, but what we can see in Ukraine is a level of impunity that is really concerning in terms of how these ultranational groups are gathering and how they operate and how they even organize as paramilitary forces. And that is a risk for the security of Ukraine and the risk of the security in the whole Russia. So this is also something that has to be followed really closely, because let us not be innocent. In Ukraine, we have high levels of corruption, even if there is a certain type of, there is a democracy in terms of they go to elections, but the government is corrupt. Not from now, but this is something that has been going on from many, many years ago. So let us not be innocent in terms of trying to portray the image that could be not necessarily the truth because of the complexity it has. And it has to do with understanding Ukraine in its context and Europe as well.
Dr. Laguardia. Dr. Gonzalez?
Yes, well, I am hoping that, yes, are you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, my mic is now, okay, are you hearing me? Yeah, are you hearing me now? Yes, okay. Now, I was saying that I'm hoping for a permanent solution to this crisis in a very short space of time. I think the longer it takes for us to get a permanent solution, life is going to be very difficult for many people throughout the world. Not to mention that there may be a continuous war that could go on for quite a while. So I'm hoping that, first of all, the Ukrainians will put up a good fight, and already they seem to be not doing too badly, which may raise the costs for Russia, which may bring Russia to the table quicker to settle on some kind of arrangement. I think if that happens, that we are likely to see some agreement taking place in a shorter time span. Already we see they are talking about talks today, and Russia has not been able to enter the main cities, which is a bit surprising given how close those cities are to Russia and how easy it is for Russia to come down and take most of those cities. I think what it shows is that the Ukrainians are fighting, they're putting up some kind of resistance, and they may well force Russia to come to some kind of settlement at an earlier stage. But we still have to wait and see. In the days ahead, we are going to see basically how this pans out. Now, in terms of a long-term solution, I have always felt that Ukrainian nationalism has to be recognized. One cannot keep on thinking that Ukraine is not a country, or Ukraine is part of Russia, and Ukraine, was created by the Tsars and all of that kind of imperialist thinking and so forth. I think we have to let go of that. And we have to begin to see Ukraine as a country that has been struggling over the years to find its identity and establish itself in the world community. Now, everything is not hunky-dory. As Dr. LaGuardia said, there has been a lot of corruption in Ukraine. There are a lot of problems about of dictatorship and so forth. But they are trying. They are trying over the years. They have been trying to hold free and fair elections. The last two elections weren't bad. They have had, I think, governments that have been recognized. And I think the present leadership seems to be one that is finding favor with a lot of people. They seem to be reasonably very proactive kind of good governance leadership. And so we have to give them the opportunity to try to develop and to try to, take their place among the nations of Europe and the nations of the world. Now, it's very difficult, as I said, to exist as a country next to the Soviet Union. Next, I keep saying Soviet Union, rather mean in this case Russia. It's very difficult to exist because for all sorts of reasons, Russia has ambitions. Russia has a country whose borders have been changing over centuries, and you never know one day where the borders are going to be. You will wake up one day and find that the Tsar sends troops down to take a particular part, or the Kremlin sends troops down to take a particular part of the country, and so it keeps going all the time. You never know where you are in Russia, and this is why a lot of the former Soviet republics, very early from the time they came out, they sought to go towards NATO because they felt they would only be secure if they enter NATO. And I understand that. If you're living in those parts of the world, you come to appreciate over time, how the Soviet army meets the Russian army meets. You're dealing with a historical imperial power that has stretched to the east and stretched to the south and stretched to the west, and who believe they're entitled to have control over certain countries and so on. So we're still in this 21st century trying to deal with this, and Ukraine is right now the object of that problem. And I would hope that they are able to come to some kind of agreement. As I pointed out, to me it's quite possible to allow the Ukrainians to go within the European Union, to allow them to continue to practice their democracy as they see it, together with the rest of the European countries and within the context of Europe, where they would have European observers of elections and stuff like that, and European norms for elections and so on. And at the same time, let them give some guarantees to Russia with respect to security that the Russians are looking for. That is to say that NATO would not come in and NATO would not put troops there, or NATO would not put intercontinental ballistic missiles or short-range missiles there on their soil. I think that is a guarantee you could give Russia. You can't give them a permanent guarantee that Ukraine may never want to go into NATO, because you never know what the Russia may do over time. So it's a kind of guarantee you're given, but if circumstances change, you still want to have the option to act otherwise and so on. But at least for now, you can give them a guarantee that this is not what you're going to do. And I think Germany and France have said that. They have said that. Merkel, for instance, has always stood up and said that no, she doesn't believe that NATO should go into Ukraine. Macron has said the same thing, and they talk about Finland making Ukraine like Finland with some kind of neutral status. So there's scope for agreement here, I think, and if people negotiate in good faith, I tend to feel that they could come to some kind of arrangement. If Russia has other ideas, which is Russia wants to make sure that Ukraine becomes like Belarus, and Ukrainians are like Russian people. They're Russian Orthodox Christians, and they were the founders of the Russian Republic, and they belong with us. If Russia has those other ideas, then the problem becomes a lot more difficult and complex. If you listen to what you hear Putin talk, you get the impression that he has other ambitions and may not be able to settle for what I am talking about here. But let's hope that they can come to some agreement and we begin to de-escalate and things become back normal within a year or two. My fear when I look at the amount of troops coming into Russia, coming into Ukraine, I feel that they are coming there to stay. That is a long-term thing, and they're not coming out there for the next, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years or something like that. And that worries me. But as I said, there's scope for diplomacy, there's scope for Russia agreeing to some arrangement that would protect its borders, and that if they negotiate in good faith. I'm not too clear about Putin's intention. Most of the observers are putting it down to Mr. Putin's view of things. And this is Mr. Putin is working, they're saying he's working in a bubble, and he has his own ideas of what he wants and doesn't necessarily mesh with what the Russian people want or what the Russian generals want, but he wants to achieve certain things. Now, if that is the case, it's going to be very difficult to settle this. I'm hoping that is not really the case, and that he's not isolated and trying to establish his own point of view on the Russian people. So in that context, I would like to say that I'm still a little hopeful that they can settle this dispute and that we could find ourselves to a solution by the end of the year or so, more or less, some kind of agreement. I don't see the UN as being able to play a very significant role. And I think here mainly the powers in Europe, the European powers, the Americans, the OECD as the Organization for Security in Europe. I tend to think these are the institutions that are most likely to bring. Turkey, for example, was offered mediation. I think they can play some kind of role as they have immediate interest as a neighbor to solve these problems. So this is my hope. I don't know. As I said, everything is up in the air at this particular point in time. So we all will have to wait and see.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez. I want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists, Dr. Mark Hurton, Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, and Dr. Laguardo Martinez for the participation in this webinar, and to thank the Emma Francois Institute for Discussion Debate for hosting this webinar. It certainly brought some more clarity to the issue and helped us to understand the implications, not just in the economic aspect, but the security aspect. And I want to just reiterate some of the takeaway points that we should go going forward. While there are economic and security implications to the region, you also brought to light the potential outcomes, potential positive outcomes, as it relates to the potential for increased collaboration in the region, intra-regional trading to ensure food security. You also mentioned the benefits that could be obtained from the increase in oil prices in Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. And you also brought to light the potential for a reduction in the irregular migration as a result of the benefits that Venezuela could experience during this time. To conclude, I want to leave a message in terms of let us continue to observe and to ensure that we consume reliable, factual information and to practice responsible netiquette, so to speak. Let us not be panicked by fake news, and to ensure that whatever we consume, whatever we share is reliable. And so I'd like to thank you for your participation in today's webinar.